Let you guys know that the glove and boot tutorial will still be coming next. I just wanted to get this one out of the way since it's one of the hardest pieces of the suit. And you will need some more experience knowledge to follow this tutorial, so it's good to know that you'll need to know how to sew invisible zippers and learn how to sew some basic hems. So go watch some other YouTube videos on that before you follow along with this one. And I also wanted to let you know that the 7-piece pattern is now on sale for $30. The first 2 days that this video is posted, there will be a 20% off sale on the pattern, so please go take advantage of that while that offer is still available. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and thanks for watching. Alright, first things first, we're going to want to fold the pants fabric over top of the elastic, and then we're going to sew down along the whole thing. It's almost like a hem, but there's elastic on the inside in order to keep the pants from slipping. We're going to go all the way down with a straight stretch stitch. Most sewing machines have this. If you don't have this, you can always go ahead and just use a regular zigzag stitch. It should work just as fine. Make sure you are not stretching as you're sewing, as that might make the waistband appear loose and it won't fit nicely against yourself. What I'm doing right now is a regular straight stitch to make sure everything's lined up. You could call this a basting stitch if you wanted. And then I'm going to go ahead and go over top of it again after this with a straight stretch stitch. So if you want to do that, that's fine. Or you can just go straight over with a straight stretch stitch, and then you will be good. You don't necessarily have to do the basting stitch if you don't want to. Now we're kind of going to do the same thing with the legs, it's just without the elastic. So it's a little bit easier. We can use a zigzag stitch for this. The most important thing is to make sure you're not stretching the fabric while you're sewing, because once again it will give it a loose look, and obviously with a 7-piece suit you want everything to be nice and tight. And you can go over this zigzag stitch twice if you'd like. One time should be more than enough. Now we're going to go ahead and sew up the butt of the suit. It's pretty straightforward. You just fold it in half and go all the way down. Make sure you're holding everything pretty securely when you're going over the elastic. Of course, use pins if you need to. I just haven't used pins for a very long time. But we will use them on the shirt. You pretty much don't need pins for most of the sewing for a suit, besides, if you want to make sure web lines are lined up properly and things. I do recommend using pins if you are very new to sewing, but I've been sewing for a few years now, so I don't necessarily need them, although they're always a good thing to have. And we're going to stop right at this point down here, and always make sure to back stitch to make sure your seams are nice and durable. This next part's pretty straightforward. Once you're done with the butt, you can see how it kind of looks like a pair of pants now. So we're just going to start at the crotch and sew all the way down to each ankle, and it'll be easier to understand what I'm talking about once we're over at the sewing machine. Now you can kind of see how the crotch is lined up, and we're starting at it, and we're going all the way down, all the way to the ankle. So you're going to sew about halfway down, and then make sure when you're towards the calf to be stretching it some to make sure that the two ends are going to line up properly. Because if they don't line up properly, then your seam at the end will be offset a little bit. So just make sure that everything is lined up once you get towards the ends. This usually isn't an issue when you have things with webs, because you can use those as kind of guidelines, but of course there are no webs here, so we kind of just gotta eyeball it. Of course, it's not as important to make sure you're sewing it as precisely when you're using just blue sections, because there's nothing that needs to line up exactly. But it is good to make sure you're still, staying inside your seam allowance and things. Make sure you're not going too far inside the seam. You don't want your pants to be too tight. You may notice that the bottom of the ankle is a bit loose when you put it on the first time. That's okay, you can always bring it in, half inch or an inch if you need to. That's what I do. The reason it's like that is because usually there's a boot stretching out the suit, but of course this is 7 pieces, so that's not the case. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you how to make the elastic for the belt of the shirt. First, we're going to need our 3-inch wide elastic and cut it to a manageable size because it comes in like 5-yard rolls. Something about this should be okay. My waist size is about 30, and I think in total the elastic going around my whole belt area is about 25 inches. It stretches quite a bit, but you still want it to be quite tight. So we go ahead and make this chalk line where the point is going to be, and then we're going to bring this over to the sewing machine. Just make sure to use a regular straight stitch, and we're going to sew all the way down, making sure that this is going to be a nice secure stitch. We're going to back stitch on both edges to ensure it does not come undone. Next, we're just going to snip off the excess. And now we're going to open up this seam, and we're going to sew on top of it to flatten it out. And this will help make sure that you won't be able to see it through the suit, as it's spandex and it's easy for things to be seen through it. Go ahead and back stitch to make sure the seam is nice and secure. And then we're just going to do that again on the other side. Now we're just going to snip off the corners. And I'm sure you can see how this is working out, as now you can see where the point of the belt will be. Make sure to use a lighter on any raw elastic edges to clean them up and ensure they don't fray. And it helps with cleaning up little parts of thread as well. As you can see, it's going to prevent the belt from slipping. And this is just to make sure that nothing comes undone. This is just to add a little bit more security to our seams. Alright, now for the complicated part. We're going to have to pin the chest piece down to the elastic. If you want to sew the blue sections to the chest piece first, go ahead and do that. I just didn't do it that way. Make sure you pin it first to the elastic in like the middle, and then pin it down on the edge so it doesn't try to fight you when you're stretching it over. It takes some practice, but you should be able to get it just fine. Next, all we're going to do is use a straight stretch stitch and go all the way down the edge, making sure we're keeping it nice and even spacing. We want this to look really clean when we're done. If you want to, you can always go ahead and use a regular straight stitch first, and then go back over it with a straight stretch stitch. And that's what I did, just to make sure I could get it really clean, because a straight stretch stitch is almost impossible to remove, whereas a regular straight stitch is very easy to remove if you mess up. you'll notice I'm pausing periodically. That is because the sewing foot gets stuck on the puff paint. So what we have to do is leave our needle in and then pick back up the sewing foot and then put the sewing foot back down. And that basically just releases the pressure that the puff paint is putting on the fabric. And there we go. You see I lifted the foot in order to release the pressure, and now we can continue onwards. Near here is when I lost some footage. It's pretty straightforward. Once you reach the tip, just leave the needle in, pick up the presser foot, rotate, and then put the presser foot back down, and you'll be able to continue onwards as you were before. And as you can see, it looks really clean. That's because we took our time to ensure the spacing was nice and even. And you'll see that it holds itself nicely together, and it gives it a nice, sharp look, which is kind of what we're looking for in a 7-piece suit. Next, what we'll do is the same exact thing, but with the back of the belt. It's pretty straightforward. I recommend starting with this piece if you've never done this before. However, it shouldn't really matter which order you do it in, as it's a pretty straightforward process once you understand the basic method of it. Once again, bring it back to the sewing machine, and we are going to make sure we lift the presser foot every time we reach some puff paint to release the pressure. We're going to make sure we're taking out our pins so we're not running them over, and we're just going to make sure that we're keeping a nice even spacing along the whole belt in order to keep it looking nice and even. Alright, this starts a segment where we're going to learn a new skill, which is sewing corners. So always make sure to snip the inside corner. Here's an example of how the pieces are going to go together. The arm and chest are pretty much the same thing, so you can follow the same steps for both. So in the description you'll find links for these pieces, and you can just trace them on your red and blue fabric. I recommend doing the squares on the blue because that's what it'll be like in your real pattern. And they're just going to go together like this. Alright, like I stated before, we're going to snip the inside edges, and that basically allows it to open up and flex. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some dots so I know where to stop while I'm sewing. It just makes this whole process a lot easier. And of course, we're going to do that with the easier piece as well, which is the piece we're going to start with. And I recommend you start with this piece as well and practice it a few times, and then maybe try to take on the harder piece. Alright, now that we're over at the sewing machine, we are going to just make sure this is all lined up. And we are going to go all the way down. We're using a zigzag stitch, and make sure that the sewing needle is either in the left or right position fully when you are at your corner, and make sure it's stabbing through that dot. Whether the left or right position of the zigzag needle works better for you may be up to your technique, the way you have things positioned, but I recommend trying both ways to see where it works better. So essentially we need to turn around this piece of fabric in order for it to be a proper corner. And when you're sewing corners and turning them like this, make sure everything is laying flat, or once you sew you may have some issues with your corners. On these test pieces, I recommend you don't backstitch, as it will be a lot easier to rip out your stitches if you need to. And then at the inside hem, we're just going to snip off the corner to make sure that it folds nicely. And as you can see, that's a pretty solid corner. Next, what we can do is try out the harder piece. Once you get everything lined up, we're going to just start And we are going to make sure that our needle is in either the right or left position, whichever is closer to the dot. So it's in the right position currently. And then we are going to situate it so we can get it to lay flat and sew the way we want to. And once we get it in that position, we'll drop our presser foot back down and continue onwards. Once we reach the end, we'll make sure our our needle is in the right side, stabbing into the dot, and then we will situate this once again. It is very important that everything lays flat or your corners will not look as good as they can. And we are still going to make our way all the way down, and remember not to backstitch just in case it doesn't look perfect. You can take the threads back apart very easily to try again. And as you can see, these corners aren't perfect, but they're still pretty good. I recommend practicing more until they look absolutely perfect. I recorded this after the tutorial, and it's been a while since I've sewn some corners, but I just wanted to make sure that there is a good example before we started sewing the chest piece. So as we're sewing, make sure you are keeping the needle on the right side of the web line or the left side, depending on which side you're sewing. For me, the needle needs to be right on the right side of the web line. And we also went over this in the mask tutorial. Just really make sure you're sewing right up against it so it looks really clean when you're sewing. And the seam should be right against the web line when you're done. It should look really clean. Just like before, we're at the corner and we're going to leave our needle in and lift our presser foot. This time our needle is on the right side, so we're going to make sure we leave our needle in the left. And just like we did with the practice pieces, it is very important to make sure that this lays flat or your corners will not look that good. A tip that may help some people is using a straight stitch to sew the corner first, and then going back over that straight stitch with a zigzag once you've already essentially lined up the stitch with the straight stitch. And that may give you really clean results. Almost essentially a basting stitch, which would just help line everything up. You can see here, the web line is all the way against the seam and the corner looks pretty solid. Make sure when you're done sewing those pieces just to sew against the elastic to keep it pretty secure, because next we're going to sew the zippers. So when sewing invisible zippers, first you want to flatten them out with the iron to make sure they're a lot easier to sew with. And if you're wondering why the back piece wasn't recorded, it's just a straight seam, and there's a color guide on the pattern, so you guys should be able to handle that just fine. Make sure we get both sides of the zippers completely flat, and make sure you do this with all your invisible zippers that you sew. As you can see here, we're now going to line up the zipper against our fabric. And you can see I made markings, which makes it a lot easier to line up both sides. So I'm just going to sew it along the markings, making sure everything lines up. And the reason I have these markings is because I already sewed the other side's invisible zippers, and you want both sides to be completely even. If you want to learn to sew invisible zippers in more depth, you'll see later in this tutorial when I sew invisible zippers against a part that has webs, there'll be a timestamp where you'll be able to see where you need to skip to. And it's kind of awkward to sew it with a regular zipper foot. Some people use invisible zipper foots. I feel they're not that necessary. All you really need to do is make sure your needle is the most left it can be without actually stabbing into the zipper. And then you need to keep like a constant pressure. Make sure you're not stretching the fabric too much while you're sewing these zippers, as it could cause the zippers to kind of buckle and bend out. I'm not sure if you've seen those wavy zippers, but they don't look all that great. Now we're going to go ahead and connect the top of the back piece to the arm. You should already have both arms sewn up and the chest sewn up by this part of the tutorial. It's just simple corners, so make sure to get those done. Make sure to stay right along the web line in order to keep it really clean. And then at the end we'll backstitch just like before. And now that we're finished with that, I'm going to show you how to sew the arm piece to the chest piece. You have to unzip the zipper in order to sew along it. It makes it a lot easier. Make sure you're not sewing over the actual zipper, or you will not be able to zip it back down. Start right next to it. It's very crucial to make sure these two seams line up right here, the red and the blue. So just make sure that they line up and you should be all good. If you need to use pins, of course use them. And now we're in a section with web lines. So puff paint usually sticks to itself, so you can kind of just stick them together. You kind of see how I'm applying a little force. But always keep checking as you're going to make sure the webs are lining up. See how I keep checking? That's the most helpful way. You can use pins, but I prefer, I guess you could call it an active method of sewing, as I keep checking to make sure everything is lining up as I'm going. Now we can go ahead and sew the collar after we've sewn both arms to the chest. And it's kind of a weird curved piece, but it's not too bad. Using some pins may help, especially if you pin it in the middle. And you don't have to worry too much about sewing against web lines for this piece, but it is kind of tricky because you need to make sure all of the vertical web lines line up with each other, and that would be the straight web lines, not the curvy ones. It is still pretty straightforward if you're following the active method of sewing I'm doing, where you don't use pins, you kind of just make sure they line up as you go. I've found that's the best way to make sure they line up. And if you've lined up everything like it should line up, as you can see, it looks pretty perfect. Next, we are going to need a zipper in the neck in order to actually get in the suit. You don't want to stretch out all your puff paint or it'll turn pretty matte. So we're just going to make sure that after we sew our first invisible zipper, we want to make markings where our next invisible zipper will be sewn. And that's just to make sure all the webs line up properly. As you can see, I have all these markings lined up with my webs. and we are just going all the way down. And if you line them up all properly with these little marks of chalk, then everything should line up perfectly, or almost perfectly. It is spandex, so it is kind of hard to get it perfect. This is probably the most difficult seam. We're going to sew all the way up one arm. We are going to stop in the middle, right here at the armpit, and then we're going to pivot our needle and sew across the back. And then we're going to do the same with the other arm. We're going to stop right there at the zipper, and then we're going to go all the way down. So you should be able to do this in one continuous stitch, and that's just the cleanest way to get the back sewn up. If you need to use pins, please use them. This is a pretty complicated piece, and I did use pins for this part just to make sure the back was nice and even. Make sure your zippers are closed when you're sewing over them. It should be going without saying. And when you're at that point, make sure to pivot, as it's kind of like a corner, but you just got to lift the foot and then pivot around. And then we're going to sew all the way across the back, making sure that everything is lining up properly. Now you've sewn both arms already, but we need to hem them. So I find it easier if I just pop these seams open. If you wanted to hem them before, you could. I just honestly forgot. But, mistakes happen, and this is one of the ways that we're going to fix them. I just want to show that mistakes can be made in the process, and this is one of the ways you can solve them with a seam ripper. Now you can see we have our seam opened back up, and we're kind of going to fold it back over top of itself. It is very crucial, just like with the pants, that we are not stretching this out while we're sewing. We're just going to use a zigzag stitch here. I did accidentally stretch it out a little bit, so my wrists are a tiny bit loose on my suit, but that's okay, because web shooters are going to cover it anyways. Of course, if you do mess up, you can always rip the stitch back out and put it back in. Alright, this is a bit of a complicated hem to do. We're just going to fold everything kind of on itself. And this is the neck. So we have the zipper to work with this hem as well. So just make sure to fold everything nice and even, and then you can go ahead and use your zigzag stitch and go all the way down. Alright, everything is hemmed, but the zippers still look pretty messy and they're folding the wrong way. So what we need to do is we need to snip the zipper. And then we're gonna kind of fold it in on itself, so it looks clean like that. And then what we'll do is bring it over to the sewing machine and put a few stitches in it just to hold it in place. After this I added a few more, but I didn't have that on camera. And then you have kind of a nice clean ending. And of course clean that up with a lighter if you need to. Alright, now we're finished. I hope you guys are enjoying the finished product. If you need help, as always, you can DM me on Instagram or reach me on my Discord server. Link in the description. And yeah, this pattern is on sale on Etsy for $30. So if you're interested in making your own suit, go check it out.